Hi, all, and welcome to the next generation of language assessment, elevating student success. Thank you so much, and sorry for that brief delay. We've already gotten started. We are already diving into our conversation, and now we want to get you involved in that too. So thank you for staying with us for a bit of technical difficulty there, but now we have you, and we're all together to have a conversation and take a deep dive into language assessment. I'm joined today by some expert panelists who will bring a very nuanced and rich experiences, their perspectives to the conversation that we'll have today. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, and then I'd like to shout out to the audience members who are joining us from all across the world this afternoon. Jeff.
Thank you, Maureen, and thank you to the PI for hosting us. A great conversation ahead of us. I realized during that technical difficulty, we probably solved all the problems and had all the solutions, but unfortunately, we didn't record it. But no, I jest there. My name is Jeff Hutcheson. I am I serve a couple of different roles. I am the Director of Advocacy and Public Policy for TESOL International Association. Also co-founder for a nonprofit, Global Ed Professionals, which works primarily with ESL organizations, but also with universities and supporting transnational education and the students there. And I've had opportunity to work closely with Trinity, which we'll hear more from during this call. So very happy to be here and add to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And I just have to also mention that TESOL was my very first conference presentation many moons ago, very early in my career when I was an ESL at the time called ESL program director. So always great to have TESOL colleagues on the call. Thanks so much. Shankar.
Thank you, Maureen, and thank you to Pi for inviting me to this conversation. My journey started, as I mentioned earlier, as a student who took the TOEFL exam to come to the US for my graduate school. Subsequent to that, finishing my doctorate in economics, I became a faculty member, worked as an SIO in a small private university, working with international students, understanding the nuances of working with diverse groups of international students. I ran an engineering program in China, which was a different set of challenges. Currently, my role is I'm the executive director for international affairs in the Chancellor's office of the CSU, California State University. We are a 23 university campus, universities that are the largest public university. We have about 17,000 international students. We certainly are looking to see how language assessment is critical in the success of our students. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Alex.
Thank you very much, Maureen, and thank you to the PI again for hosting this. So my name is Alex Thorp, and I'm head of the Centrally Coordinated Markets at Trinity College London. And I know, how many of you will know Trinity, but one thing we do, we operate in the arts space, dance, music, drama, but we provide English language assessments. We're here to talk about those. I come from an academic background at Trinity. Before that, I was a teacher trainer in the English language teaching space. So really interested to dive in and to explore English language assessments for admissions purposes.
I really appreciate the diverse and rich perspectives that you bring to the work that we all do in this sector and also to our conversation today. And shout out to all the folks who are joining us today on the live call and all those who will join us on the replay. So we've got folks tuning in from sunny South Florida, chilly Chicago, foggy Seattle. I'm loving these descriptors. From the 316, so that's super niche. So if you know what that means, you can post it in the chat. From Los Angeles and Stratford-upon-Avon, New York City, Indiana, India, Winnipeg, Manitoba. So welcome to all of our worldwide viewers today. And foggy Seattle, I will be sure to bring my raincoat when I leave at 4:30 a.m. for Seattle tomorrow morning. So I encourage you to continue the chat that you've already started here in our chat, and also to weigh in on the polls on the right-hand side if you've not done so. Our third icon down on the right-hand side is a poll. And I'm going to ask you to kick us off, audience, with letting us know how you feel about this question. How do you define a successful student journey? Is it retention rate, graduation rate, class participation, perhaps all of the above? Or maybe you have some other poll options that you would have liked to have seen. And if that's the case, please let us know in the chat. You've got questions for our panelists. Please put that in the Q&A section, which is the second icon down on the right-hand side. So how do you define a successful student journey? Well, panelists, our audience has said, for the most part, 95% of our audience who have weighed in on the poll say all of the above: retention rate, graduation rate, class participation. So we'll be getting into what those look like in terms of the conversation around language assessment as we go through. But I want to start off with a really heavy question for you. And it's talking about students, their diverse learning styles, their cultural context, and the goals of today's students. And how can we design and deliver language assessments today, given all of those factors, without compromising academic rigor? Alex, I'm going to ask you to start on this.
Yeah, thank you, Maureen. I mean, for me, this really is around the personalization. You know, every individual that takes these tests, will be them for admissions purposes, and we need that academic rigor that sits at the heart of all of this. But really, it is around that person, and these tests can be personalized. They can involve the person. It can give them agency over the language they own and they use. And I think this is around having tasks that are really based on real life, authentic activity. So the kind of tasks a candidate will use, not just in the test, but they're going to carry through into their everyday life. So, and the opportunity, as I say, to be personalized, to use language, maybe around the subject they're going to read, but it has to be not just something that's so framed and prescriptive that it's one size fits all, but a test that's designed to be able to encapsulate the individual and reward, if you like, and pull out the language from that individual. So putting the candidate at the heart of the assessment.
Shankar, something to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at proficiency in language, it's such a nuanced matter. If you think about India, where people speak a lot of different languages, and often by necessity, they speak in English to each other. And that's another way of sort of making sure that you actually are proficient in the language, right? As opposed to a different country where English is a subject that they might take within their K through 12 system as a subject matter, just like geography or something. But the use of English then might not be the one that happens in a day-to-day setting, right? So their proficiency needs to be tested differently than, say, somebody from India. And India by itself is also very different. If you look at some tier 1 cities versus tier 3, tier 4 cities, the proficiencies might vary quite significantly. So what we're trying to do here is to test them, reach them at that level where they are, and figure out where their proficiency is. Because at the end of the day, when they come to an institution like ours, we want to make sure, Maureen, to the poll question, right? We want to make sure that the students are assimilating well, they're succeeding well, they're graduating, they're having these outcomes. So, you know, to Alex's point, we have to figure out a way to test these students so that we know that they're able to speak, but what is that level and how do we kind of meet that?
Yeah. And I'll just add in there, when we talk about the confluence of the cultural background, the social impact, as well as the learning styles, if you will, or the diverse learning styles of the students, assessment needs to be much more than just, can you conjugate your verbs and put things in the correct context. I think a lot of it will capture as the assessments grow in their strengths here. Capturing these, what do you call them, 21st century skills, the motivation, the critical thinking that is needed, that is really what's going on behind the language that is out front. So it's not just a linguistic competence, if you will, it's a sociolinguistics competence. It's being able to fill in gaps in discourse and how the individual is able to handle that language and use that language within their context, as Shankar was talking about. I also feel that it's also a cultural aspect to it, and part of the institutions receiving students. I think I can probably we all have these stories sitting around, and perhaps sitting around in the faculty senate debrief, and there's one professor saying, "Well, I just need people to speak English." And it's I think we need a cultural shift that also views the literacies of the students as an asset, and not as a deficit. Just because they may not be able to speak in Elizabethan English doesn't mean that they are lacking in what they can contribute. So if we can view what they have in their home language as an asset and how that contributes in the assessment process, I think we're moving much closer to addressing that question.
Jeff, I have sat in that faculty senate meeting that you referenced. So yeah, thank you for emphasizing the assets-based approach over the deficits-based. And I want to lean in a bit to this idea of the student-centered approach that you brought up, Alex, and that Shankar and Jeff have commented about as well, and the role that student-centered assessment plays in the idea that ensuring that learners are not just evaluated, but also that they feel empowered in this process. And there's more, how that contributes to lifelong learning and that passion for lifelong learning.
And I think, yeah, if I may, I mean, this comes back to that, and I talked about the authenticity of the task. And it's very easy to create an academic task where you may use a kind of rote, memorized phrase or so on and so forth, which I've learned. Can I really transpose that into my everyday experience? And I think this is where that authentic task comes in. And what we need to do, and what we try to do, is look at what will that day-to-day experience be of a candidate when I'm in a seminar, when I'm in a lecture, when I'm actually having to synthesize text into, and so on, and all those skills, getting that task as close to what they'll be doing in a real life environment when they're studying. But again, it's an authentic task. It's not a prescripted rote memory exercise. And that really links in, Jeff. And that's the difficult thing, is writing into those tasks those communicative competencies, the ability to interact. And those competencies, again, reflect so many broad skills. And this is, again, really at the heart of Trinity. I mean, we're an educational charity, but we've always looked at that communicative competence. And that's what we try to pull out in those assessments. But it's the authenticity of task, i.e. reflecting real life, is so key.
No, if we've all been in situations where we've learned a different language. And if you think about putting yourself in those shoes, of how do you express yourself? I was terrible in learning Mandarin, but I did put myself out there, right? I mean, you have to be vulnerable. And this aspect that, Alex, you talk about, this communicative aspect, you need to be able to think about the student who's taking this test, that the object of that test is to make that journey to come to a new place, to be in a new learning environment, and then put themselves out there and become vulnerable. Right? And to be able to do that in a seminar, or even ask a question to a professor, or talk to some of your students, other classmates. So being able to do that, being able to assess that, is going to be very important. And I think if we keep that in mind, we might devise better ways to ask those questions, right? Contextualizing it is also important. Some cultural concepts people don't get. And if you test them on that cultural concept, that's not doing any service to that student. Neither is it helping me as a recipient of an international student to know that, well, they answered this question poorly, but there is no context for those students on that.
Keeping with this idea of the personalized approach to student learning, to language assessment, Jeff, I'm curious, I know you're very involved with TESOL and the advocacy groups, and being at the conferences and in the many language conferences you attend, what's the word on the street as far as innovations go and what we might expect in the future in terms of language assessment? What are people talking about making personalized feedback more actionable, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I had the crystal ball to be able to answer that. But immediately as you asked that, we broached that. I go to that. We've probably heard it before. I don't know if you've heard it, that AI thing.
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Might have heard about that and the impact of that. And it is an area that is has been of great benefit within the classroom to educators to have that, especially working with English learners. And I speak not from the perspective of ensuring that people have the skills they need before they come into the higher ed environment, but if you're part of an English language program, for example, and how you're dealing and working with you might have a classroom full of 5 to 10 different languages, home languages that you're working with in that classroom. So I think the future is definitely going to be in AI. How that's going to manifest remains to be seen. But I really think it's imperative upon not just the educational community, but the associations and organizations, and to a certain degree the government associations, to ensure that there's guardrails that protect the students in this process, the ethical considerations that need to be there, but also addressing the concerns that an institution is going to have when it comes to the integrity of the exam and the authenticity of those students' responses in that process. So I think that's really where the future is going to be. Who knows? We all may be. I just saw. Where was it? Was it somewhere? I think it was up in the Northeast, maybe up near you, Maureen. There was a private school, a high school that now everything is online and it's all virtual. Not just the sense of Zoom calls, but what do you call those things you put on your eyes for the? Yeah.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
I need to do a little catch up on that area. If you.
Yeah, goggles. Yeah. And so the students that you're referencing are at home and they're having this learning experience wearing their VR.
They're having their learning experience. A couple of years ago, I was talking to an entrepreneur that had developed, I don't think he ever got it off the ground, but he had developed a whole university experience in which the student was immersed in that VR environment to interact with it. So it's challenging. It's so rapid and it's changing, and the involved evolution, if you will, of what's going on and how that's going to translate into the experience that the student has, the mobility that the student has around the globe, and their ability to access learning. It's changing rapidly.
So let's stick with this, with the technology piece, and now apply it to the improvements and increases in access, in equity, and how it can, the personalized feedback really speaks to that access and equity piece of this conversation. Your thoughts, panel?
I think so. As an institution, we do take pride in making sure that there is equity and access, right? And the idea that we have to serve diverse student bodies. So if we translate that into this particular assessment of language, right? I mean, I go back to my experience. There were maybe 5 centers in India where we could take TOEFL exams back then. So if you came from a different city, you're going overnight to another place and waiting in front of the test center and doing that. So technology has helped us kind of alleviate some of that so that access is available. Of course, the impediment there was that the ability to have access to stable internet, which allows you to then take these tests. But it certainly has changed the game quite significantly, right? On the enrollment management side, we've also kind of shrunk our cycle in terms of how much time we want to take to make decisions on students, right? And so to be able to have students not wait for, say, 3 months to go take the next cycle of a language assessment and take it whenever they want, certainly helps our enrollment management people say, yes, we've made that decision. So that is the sort of the great equalizer, if you will, that we are seeing, is that we're now able to do this, and in different countries it's even better, right? I mean, there are ways that we can do this. We've not been able to access students from many countries if they didn't have this kind of technology. So I feel like it serves my institution better in knowing that we can reach a larger group of students because they can access exams and assessments that are going to be more easily available to them.
Yeah, Shankar, I think, from Trinity's perspective, of course, and this also happened in the pandemic, didn't it, where it really accelerated that online requirement, and not only in teaching but in the assessment. And we've worked for many years with online assessment, but our recent ISE digital full skills test, this is something that is available now fully online, and it's that ability to be able to offer that standardized test, as you say, as long as you have that minimum level of online availability in terms of the internet, you can access a test. And we know, if you're working in admissions, that someone that's taken that test, albeit in India or Pakistan or Mexico or wherever else on the globe, what I need is that test that I can trust to say it's been delivered in terms of equity. Yes, it's been accessible, but the standardization that is on a framework, a reference that I can trust and that is familiar, that I know. And again, this is something that we try to provide. And this comes back, I know we had the question in the poll around the CEFR, but going back to AI, and again, it's one of those things, every time I say it now, I almost blush because AI, but it's a disruptor. And I think whilst it's really set us all back on our back foot and we're a little bit alarmed by it, it provides some huge tools. And certainly from an assessment perspective, of course, it can enable us to generate a testing pool in terms of items very quickly. You could be looking at auto marking and all this kind of thing. But I think the other thing that it's really made me think about is this kind of also the importance of human agency. So when we do look at language and that communicative competence, maybe we will develop, and there will be engines and AI-driven solutions that do create co-constructed communication scenarios. But that human agency is so important. And again, that element of having that co-constructed communication, I think, is an element that we really need to protect. It's certainly something, again, that communication and co-construction interaction that sits at the heart of what we assess at Trinity.
And if I may add on here just a little bit, Maureen, especially when you get into the approach or strategy of ensuring equity, and well, I just won't talk about assessment. I'll talk about the overall recruitment that a university is engaged in. When you put it on the international component or the international platform, how much of the focus that we have domestically is being transferred into the international context? Because a lot of times there's pressure to bring in the international students, because especially if you're a public university, primarily they're going to be out of state. They're bringing in a higher tuition rate. Well, if there is a frame that is changed so that the international market is looked at in terms of equity, so that there's an investment, the first generation students, you're not just going for what might be the higher socioeconomic status recruitment pools, but looking for those marginalized groups that, again, back to asset, have that ability, but have not had that opportunity presented to them. I did have opportunity to work with the university over here in New Jersey. Matter of fact, that had not just focused domestically on the equity piece, but focused internationally on that, putting money into the scholarships to make it accessible for those students. So that was a breath of fresh air in that aspect. So it is going out intentionally to have that equity lens in that recruitment process. But also another piece of that, and we may not even have time to address this. We've talked about digital access, but there's digital literacy that is involved in that as well. It's one thing to have the access to that, but how do the students have that literacy to begin with? And back, I think Alex's point about when the pandemic came, that exposed a lot of gaps in the literacy environment there. So a lot of these questions that need to be addressed as institutions look through an equity lens at recruitment, especially on the international front there.
I think we could have a whole webinar and a whole session on the digital literacy piece alone, or any number of these topics that you're addressing underneath this overall umbrella. So I thank you for bringing them up. And I'm taking lots of notes to follow up with you after about these pieces. And in the meantime, I'll shout out again to our audience who are here with us and ask if you have questions as well for our panelists. Please put them in the Q&A section. You'll see the second icon down on your right-hand side. So please go ahead and ask questions to our panelists via that Q&A chat. Now, Alex, you mentioned CEFR. just a little while ago. Yes. And one of our poll questions, and 18% I'm seeing, let's see, CEFR, 18, almost 20% of our audience here is not familiar with CEFR. So could you explain a bit about that?
Yep, I lost a little bit of that, but I think I've got most of the questions. So the CEFR is the Common European Framework for the Reference of Language. Now, common European, it makes it sound very Eurocentric, but actually this is very much a globally applied model of language. Now, what is the CEFR? Well, essentially it's a framework. It's literally looking at different subskills and competencies within language so that we can have a standard by which we know that someone that we call a given level in one location, anywhere else in the world, we know that someone of that same level would have the same sub-skills, competencies, and able to do the same thing. Now, there are 3 letters in the CFR, A, B, C, and then there are sub-levels, so A1, and pre-A1 would be forced beginner, A2, B1, B2, your intermediate, C1 would be what we would call advanced, C2 is a proficient level. Now, huge amount of data in the CFR, and there was a later something called the companion volume that was published. And this isn't just linguistic competence critically. So this isn't just grammar items and vocabulary. This really looks at a whole range of sub-skills, and in the companion volume, even things like mediation. So there's a real rich reference to what a candidate or an individual should or could do at a given level. And I think critically, again, I'll talk about Trinity, of course I will from Trinity, but if we took an example of an ISE candidate, so someone that took our exam, and I know that it's someone that took that exam that got a B2, now let's say that B2 was, again, take an example of a candidate in India, and then I had someone in Mexico that had a B2. Now I know I could look in great detail at what those sub-skills and competencies are, that I could say, right, what is it the candidate can do if they have achieved an exam that gives them a B2 level of competency. And this is critical for admissions purposes, because I can look at those different grades. And again, ISE is very detailed in its mapping to the CFR. So I can say, this is what I need a candidate to be able to do to succeed in that program. This is what I need them to be able to do to be able to access the input, participate fully, and all those different elements we had in that poll. And this is where an admissions department can say, right, we are going to set our level at C1, for example, so an advanced level, and all those sub-skills are listed within, and therefore I know an exam that is very accurately mapped at that level will give me that credible evidence that the candidate can do those things. And it's all about, again, what can be done, going back to the first point. So yeah, very quick overview of the CFR. Again, give me another webinar.
Yeah, exactly. That's its own webinar. And then our thanks for that, Alex. Our final question is in the poll, rather, not my final. I've got lots more, so buckle up. Our final poll question: do you worry about international students integrating? And the vote's really split between yes, no, and sometimes. So what I'm going to ask you to do, audience, is to let us know if you are worried about international students integrating, and what happens when they're on our campuses after they take their test, they get their acceptance, they've come to our campuses. Do you worry about them integrating? For those who said yes or sometimes, what are some of those worries? And panelists, I'll ask you to share your thoughts about what some of the things that you recommend as best practices in helping ease that transition once students are in front of us, and helping with any language support needed once at the host institution.
So as an international student, one of the things that was critical when I arrived here was to try to see how I can assimilate into the university environment, right? And that brings its own challenges. And I remember having friends who were from other countries whose language proficiency was not at the same level. And I saw the struggles that they had. Years later, when I was a faculty member, to see the students kind of clam up and not talk because they were not comfortable in how proficient they were, that creates a very negative impact on that student, not just academically, but also socially, culturally, and overall an experience that is not going to be very favorable, right? So we would initiate sort of conversation buddies. We would initiate, sort of host families, friendship family, we call them friendship families, getting them back out into the community so that they can start talking, right? When you're in an university environment, you're not insular. You have to be, weaved into that community. So there's a lot of attention that needs to be paid to those as well. So, I do worry about assimilation. I was one of the people that put that in the poll, because it is very critical that we do that, because looking at it from California's perspective right now, being one of the most diverse states, I want my California residents to be exposed to other cultures. Even though we have many cultures here, the Indian student that's coming right out of India to the second generation Indian student here, they're very different, right? So making sure that that connections happen, making sure that we create those spaces is very, very important. And it's important, it's incumbent on as institutions, it's incumbent on us to provide those frameworks, right? Yeah. Whether it's additional language help, whether it's going to be social help, cultural help, or so.
And as the title of this, or subtitle of our conversation today, is Elevating Student Success, I think it's wise that we discuss this aspect of student success. We put in retention rate, graduation rate, class participation, all of the above in the first poll as elements of a successful student journey, but can't get to those aspects if there are issues around that integration and assimilation. So I appreciate you sharing those best practices. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, Maureen, I'll be happy to jump in on that, because I love the fact that you did bring up integration. It is something of importance, well beyond just what's at the university. It's a conversation going on now nationally here in the U.S., especially around immigrant immigration is something that the U.S. Department of Education is focused on. But when you break it down into the institution, if your mindset is focused solely upon that language assessment, and it is devolved, I will, to just that single point, can they get a particular score on a particular test? And even to a certain degree, the student, instead of viewing an assessment as a vehicle to help them improve, as it's just a number. I need a number. No, let's look at what you're able to do. And so if you can change that mindset at the institution, and then also bring around the other services that are there, is that really look at this as integration in the institution. So it's not just language, it's cultural understanding, it's social interaction, it's financial access, it's navigating the health insurance, the transportation, the whole aspect of being bicultural, if you will, or multicultural in this case, takes the support services, whether or not the student may or may not see them. Some students are going to come in and have an independence about them, but that they're there, and even underneath, you can see them working to help support the integration of the students for that success, to get them to that point. I think that is vital in any institution looking at it, to look at it holistically. So you have departments, faculty working together to ensure that there's supports there, that they have an understanding of that this is a process of an integration process. It is not they've passed a Trinity exam, they've passed a TOEFL, they passed an IELTS, and boom, they're in, and leave it up to that. Just the same as we work with domestic students. We realize that there are ways that we need to come alongside and support and help them in that path. So looking at that holistically is quite valuable to that success. I appreciate you bringing that up. It's not just that metric. It is a process, and it's a village, if you will, of coming together for that.
And if I could add to that, Joe, I mean, they're all critical points, and that whole point around integration. And I come from a testing organization, so Trinity, but I would say test choice is so critical here as a litmus, as an indicator. Of course, there's a huge amount of work our institutions need to do to facilitate that integration, and there's that danger of closed subcultures or isolation. But when we look at just the test, if you have tests that really focus on linguistic competencies, and by linguistic competencies, I mean the grammar, vocabulary, lexis, the kind of phonology, there is a danger that those building blocks don't move the candidate or enable the candidate to really participate fully in a linguistic environment. And this is why, and there are many tests that do it, but why we really do need to look at those interactive communicative competencies. Now, for fear of repeating myself, I know I've said it already, but we often talk about something called positive washback, and this idea that when you introduce a test, when you're preparing for that test and a teacher is teaching for that test, the candidate is learning, that test has a big impact on what is happening in the classroom. And when we talk about positive washback, is that a positive influence that's actually enabling the learning to go in the right direction or not? And again, coming from Trinity's perspective, it's really something by design. We look at our test to say that will have that positive influence on the learning to enable the candidate to have those interactive competencies. So it's, again, the linguistic competencies are absolutely essential. They're building blocks, but there are other skills that surround them that we have to be embodying in the tests.
So we're getting some really fantastic questions in our Q&A section of our screen here, and I want to make sure that I get to all of them. But some things that you all just recently mentioned really speak to the admissions process. And so I want, before I move on to audience questions, I want to ask, are there any changes to current admissions processes that you think could improve the alignment between language assessment and equitable evaluation of a diverse student population?
I think we have to look at it holistically, and this is something that in our system, each campus, each university is working on its own enrollment management, admissions process. But you do have to take that into account in terms of where language proficiency is for students. One part of my job is actually I have a system-wide study abroad program. We send about 600 students to study abroad. And oftentimes I encounter heritage students, whether they are Spanish speaking at home or Japanese speaking or Korean. But their proficiency is very, very different. They might speak the language very fluently, perhaps, but there are other skills which Alex's test would need to look into is, are they able to write? Are they able to read? Are they able to comprehend and express? Those are very, very different. So on the flip side, then if I'm having incoming international students, I do have to know how those aspects of the student's proficiency are being tested. You brought up a point, Alex, before of a B2 from India versus a B2 from Mexico. I mean, it would be great to know that those two students have the same proficiency, despite the fact that they come from very culturally different environments, right? So that the baseline is going to be tested, and as long as I can trust that baseline, then I know that the student will be able to perform where they need to be. So that is something that we do pay attention to, and often it's a nuanced thing, right? You can keep a cutoff point, but then you have to kind of look in and around that cutoff point to see where you can admit a student or not.
Mm. And I think, if I may just echo one of the points there, Shankar, is around knowing the tests you're using. Now, there are many admissions departments, dare I say it, and I'm not being critical, but there are, we use this test because we've always used it. We use it because it's the standard we're used to. But, I really would recommend anyone who's working in the environment, what are the sub-skills the test is actually assessing? Look at the rating criteria, look at the real nuts and bolts, because once you understand the individual tasks and what they're trying to extrapolate and assess, then you'll see what it is you're getting. And again, I think often we assume that a test does what it says on the label. And again, I could say this about any test. All I'm saying is dig deep, look really at the skills and ask yourself, what are the sub-skills that we're being assessed in that task? And the other thing really here is around standardization. So again, what is the framework? What is the frame of reference we're using? We've talked about the CEFR, for example, so knowing again how those levels work. So again, the familiarization with the framework, with the tasks is really critical.
Thank you so much. One more piece about the admissions process. I'm wondering, can admissions officers make better use of language assessment or language assessment tools to help them make better informed decisions about student readiness and potential, and to what extent? How?
Well, I'll just chime in a little bit, and I'll let Alex and Shankar extrapolate a little bit more from their experience. I had opportunity to work in that admissions office, and I fell into that trap too initially that Alex was talking about, just looking for that score and not looking at the readiness of the student. And it was combined because sometimes admission offices are under pressure. They're trying to bring in numbers of students, and so if they've got that score, you're bringing them in. Well, if you're working with your recruitment channels, or however those recruitment channels may be built, to help with that pipeline of students and where they are to guide them in the right thing. And if you're approaching this ethically, not to say that you're not approaching it ethically if you don't, but to by that I mean with the student's best interest, rather than the institution's best interest. You're going to find that a lot of times they're not that different there. If you're focusing what's going to be best for the student, are they really right for this? So if you can dig deep into that test, as Alex was talking about, and know how they're able to handle gaps in languages, can they communicate across different skill sets? How do they handle information? Do they work in group environments? That will help inform you in your decisions, and it makes you a better, I guess, a better steward, if you will, in your role as an admissions officer and enrollment management there. Because it's ultimately by focusing on what's best for the student, it's going to improve the institution, the quality of what's coming in for the institution as well.
Yeah, we're coming full circle now, Jeff, to our opening about the student-centered approach and elevating student success. So thank you so much for those comments. I want to give you a scenario here. We've got someone in our audience who's in a situation where there's a monolith of international students from the same cultural background or educational background, wanting to know what strategies they can use institutionally to encourage the value of acquiring, quote, Western academic culture. Your thoughts on that?
So when I was in my teaching economics, especially in my grad program, there was a lot of students that came from India, not just in my program, but also IT and so on. And one way that I admonished them was to say that if you wanted to come and hang out just with your own kind, you could have just stayed home. Why did you spend this much money to come here? That apart, I think it's a serious problem, right? I think we want to make sure and keep in mind that the situation can be flipped very easily, in that the assumption that American students are inherently outgoing and will go out and meet these international students and talk to them. That's also not true. So you have to get both of these groups of students to come out of their shell and create these spaces and be able to do that, right? Whether it's in a single classroom or it's within the international office of a university, to be able to create those opportunities. And messaging has to be from everybody, right? So I rely a lot on my personal experience when I'm talking to these incoming students. But the fact that, I often talk about one international student coming and studying in, say, the United States impacts a circle of people around them back in their home country. The same holds true for study abroad. And I think I would talk about it like a factor of 5 or 6 people, because you now dispel all the stereotypes and myths that people have back in their home country about, say, the United States or Americans, right? So assimilating them, creating those spaces, and making that as part of your culture in your institution, that has to be central to what you do. Otherwise, it's very difficult. Students will gravitate towards their comfort zone very easily. They're already in a different environment, so it's a lot easier to do that. I mean, I see that with our study abroad students, right? They all go hang out with other American students. So we do have to work on that.
Yeah, Jaishankar, I appreciate you talking about the cultural aspect of that, because I think the more that you have an understanding of what's in play, it's not just, as I think the question was about Western academic culture, but also having an understanding of what their academic culture is. and the expectations. And, you build those coalitions internally and externally to help with that process. Internally, you're working with the different service areas as well as the departments, faculty departments with them, and so they can better understand what they're facing when they go in the classroom. But also externally and within the community, what ethnic or language groups are out there that are trusted partners for your students. You were talking about that extension and representation, and so if you can tap in and solicit the support to speak directly from the student, from their trusted sources, it's going to be a big help in that area.
Great.
I want to add one thing. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to bring our faculty to understand this concept as well. Because we have a lot of faculty who simply say, well, they showed up here, they better match to where I am, otherwise they can fail. And I think that's a very disastrous kind of approach. And we do have a lot of faculty like that are not internationally tuned.
Yeah, and I think there are other dangers as well when you have a large representation from one particular language group. And, we've had the other side of this where other candidates and students who are of L1, so they may be American, for example, and they would say, actually, the quality of teaching is now being diluted because of accommodations made by the faculty to put up with some of the weaknesses of other groups. So this is why I think bar is becoming ever higher for admissions staff, and it's such a difficult thing to make sure we're going full circle, but the accessibility of the program, that we're able to do what I am able to do what is required of the program from the get-go, and it's a real challenge.
Yeah. So I see that my friend Sean Dyer is in the audience, and he's posed a question to all of you. Thank you, Sean, for your question. Could we hear more about integrated skills in language proficiency for student success?
Hello, Sean. Lovely to know you're here, Sean, or wherever there is. If I may kick off with that, I think certainly from the testing perspective, it's absolutely vital that we integrate skill usage. We all know, we never ever use language really in an isolated skill set. When do you read without writing? When do you write without reading, and so on and so forth? And I think what we've done, certainly with integrated skills in English, ISE, which is the Trinity 4 skills exam, is exactly what it says on the tin. We assess the language in an integrated format. So you will see, for example, and again, it's all the way through the test, but you would assimilate across various texts in the reading into the writing. So you have the reading into writing. You would also, in your listening, you will listen to, for example, a dialogue, and then you will report verbally. So you have that idea that these skills are never discrete. They never operate purely isolated. So in a way, that's our task to make sure that those real life, and I go back to what I was saying about authenticity of task, that we don't isolate those skills, because the minute you do, it becomes slightly artificial because we don't really isolate them in real life. So from a testing perspective, written into the very fabric of the test, in many ways, if you look at the test and the different skills, how we integrate the skills in the test.
Yeah, some really great questions coming in. Here's another good one for all of you. I'm cognizant of time, so I'm going to get right to this next one. So we talked a lot about using language tests to prepare students as an entry requirement, but how could we better use it to prepare students to integrate them in around that conversation that you all had about the importance of integration? So how might we use this test to better support students as they integrate?
I'll just jump in and take a stab here, Maureen. I think it goes back really to your role in helping to change that culture on the institution, where you can bring in the assessments and the understanding of the exams, like Alex was extrapolating on how the ISE is put together, what it actually means. So, it's just one thing to say, well, CEFR, it's a B2 or C1, or what does that actually mean? And how can you take that and then help in building the services and the programs and the support that you have? It may be as simple as changing timing and how you process things. It may be it may be informing the faculty orientation, whatever that may be. But but being active in that and active and engaged in that cultural change so that it's not siloed on the institution. I mean, I know that's probably an impossible task to get that integration, but to utilize that assessment, to know what it means beyond just that metric or that number, that it's a score, so it's passed, they're in. What does it actually mean? What does it tell us about the student, and how is that beneficial? How is it helpful for your department, for your service area, your support systems? I think that's really one of the key things that if you can manage that and take that assessment beyond the score, and infuse it within what you do, you're going to really help to focus upon and prepare those students for their success.
Yeah, I would echo that, Jeff. And I think, let's be frank, there's no silver bullet. There's not a test that's going to give a candidate confidence and they're going to be this outgoing individual. So I think there are other questions there. That's the next webinar. But in terms of those authentic tasks and going back, that interactional competence, do we have a task that enables the candidate to show that they can take control of the communication? Now, if you look at the CEFR B2 level, there you see descriptors of soft skills of being able to control and steer conversation, to react and respond appropriately. Those are written into the fabric of what we've done with ISE. So that a candidate can, again, if they pass at that level, they can interact. There's no silver bullet, but you do get that indication, that indicative response, that indicative result that will say this is what the candidate can do.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree that I think putting so much pressure on the tests and test score is unfair. What we do with that once the students have arrived is important to keep in mind, and then work with it. I think there are ways that AI can help. I mean, I was thinking just as we were talking, an additional thing as a last step for sort of the borderline cases could be a set of questions that are uploaded and a video conversation is happening where a admissions counselor is simply just posting those questions, at least to see what the conversation looks like, right? And create that authenticity that you talk about. So I think we don't want to put that much pressure on a test, but the test can also adapt and be better.
We've got a great question about mentorship programs and how could we integrate them into language assessments to provide students with guidance on how to leverage their language skills for success both within and beyond the classroom. Great question. Your thoughts?
I look at it as when the student has arrived onto my campus, what we do with them and how we can use that. Because every student's situation is going to be very different and depends on the institution that they go to, depends on the region that they go to. So I would say that, I welcome my student and we have a language skill set that we've already done. Here are some resources to better yourself as you go. If you're looking for something on the technical side, here are the people that you would work with. If you're looking for something on communications, here's something else that you can work with. So I think I would put that on our institutions to be able to come up with these kinds of tools or guidance, right? At the end of the day, I want to make sure that my student that comes from another country is no different than a student that is in Long Beach right now. Right? Yeah. We want to make sure that we provide, provide those resources for them.
In just a moment, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to have a final word, thoughts, reflections about our conversation today. We certainly have covered a lot of topics, many of which could, as we've said, be their own webinar or perhaps the topics of future conference conversations in the expo hall when we all see each other next. But some of the things that have really stood out to me that you have highlighted are the need for a holistic approach and student-centered approach. Make it part of the culture of your institution. The importance of digital literacy, promoting human agency, assets-based approach, real-world application, and having authentic learning opportunities. So really important pieces that you've highlighted, and all of those pieces have been woven throughout all of your answers and comments to each other's answers as well. So I want to thank you very much for sharing these insights with us today. And your final thoughts now, Jeff.
Thank you, Maureen. Final thoughts. I'll just be brief. I know this is complex, and you have a whole, I guess, not portfolio, but just a whole spectrum of assessment tools out there at your disposal. I would not isolate yourself into one. I know it's easier to say, okay, I'm just going to choose one and go with it. But if you're looking for equity, if you're looking for access, don't create more barriers. And then start working with those tests, know those tests and assessments to better inform not just your decisions on the admissions process, but what you're doing at the institution, how you're integrating services there. And I will always go back to this that you mentioned in one of the things. I know it's another webinar point, but that asset base, don't view the lack of English, whatever that may look like, as a deficit. You look at the whole student, what they're bringing to the table. Just because the proficiency may or may not be there, that does not take away from the fact that they have assets far beyond what I may even possess as I'm sitting there looking at the paperwork. So just keeping that in mind.
Love those final thoughts. Thanks, Jeff. Shankar.
So I always think about knowledge is not the domain of just one language. Knowledge exists in every language. And if we really think about why we are here and what we do, it's that international education piece of creating opportunities for everybody, right? So I think from that perspective, we want to make sure that we can assess students so that they can succeed, right? And we have to be very creative in doing that. I remember talking to a student in India, and just from that conversation, I was able to figure out that she's proficient enough, and I brought her in to study, and she's doing fantastic work now. So, so we have to be creative in how we do these things, and as Jeff pointed out, be more open-minded, try to figure out, because at the end of the day, that person's proficiency in mathematics or physics is not governed by how much English they know, but that can benefit all societies everywhere. And how do you bridge that gap between those two? So thank you.
Important, insightful, and beautiful reminder. Thank you, Shankar. Alex, you've got the last word today.
Thank you very much, Maureen. I just, in this conversation, it just always shocks me the size of the responsibility, the accountability of admissions departments. And I think we can never exaggerate that, because that's, allowing someone into your institution, you are responsible, therefore, for what happens to that individual. And I think my closing words would be, really look at your choices. There are many choices out there, as Jeff said, and it really is around exploring those in detail. Which are the ones that really can indicate candidates, and by candidate I mean students, ability and their likelihood of succeeding in an academic program. But again, it relates to so many skills, such a broad skill set. So again, know your tests, have a real good dig around, and let them speak for themselves. But obviously, I'm speaking from the perspective of Trinity. We've done what we can to make that test do all the things we've talked about during this session. So again, thank you for the opportunity to do that.
Thank you so much. And huge thank you to our audience as well for engaging with us this past hour, and for your thoughtful questions for our panelists. If you'd like to find out more about ISE Digital, please click the green link below. And until then, I'm Maureen Manning from the PI.
Thank you.
So, bye-bye.